Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers. Let's talk about books. We are testing out a new microphone. I think it'll be a little bit better because it's closer to me. We shall see. Today we're going to talk about The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. Now, if you've been around, you may have seen me open this as one of my mysterious books for 2024. I actually have two more after this. We're only a little bit behind, and I do want to say that for readers, it's really, really important for us to emphasize, especially this time of year, but just in general, that reading is a hobby for most of us. I realize some folks read for work or for school. That's a little bit different. You've got to do what you got to do. But if you're reading for fun, if you're reading for pleasure, for a hobby, it's okay not to read as much as you intended to read. I found in tracking my books this year that I did my most reading in the middle of the year. I will do a kind of wrap up 2024, embark upon 2025 kind of video where I talk about what I read and when I read it and that kind of stuff. The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck is historical fiction. It is set in pre-revolutionary China. So it's during the end of the reign of the last Chinese emperor. It follows a man named Wang Lung, opening on the day that he is to be married to a woman called Olan. It is an arranged marriage, marriage of convenience. And so we're basically following his adult life. So Wang Lung is building a family. He starts with a decent but small plot of land that he inherited from his father. And throughout the book, he begins to want to expand, to grow his wealth, to raise his family's status in the community, and also build and also expand his land. The woman that he marries is really suited to be a farmer's wife. And again, this is an arranged marriage. His father actually arranges it. They don't even meet each other until the day that they are to be married. Very different system, obviously, from what we're used to in the modern West. He appreciates at first that she works really hard on the farm and then goes back to the house and prepares meals and keeps the house clean, takes care of his father, takes care of him. And he appreciates also that she bears sons for him. This is a society and a time period in which sons are prized very highly. Daughters are generally considered worthless because they are married out of the household, whereas sons expand the household. It's an interesting dichotomy. I'm sure we could talk at length about the role of women in the society as presented in this book, where women brought into the house have value, women who leave the house do not. But I am not a scholar of Chinese history, and so I don't want to bungle that discussion based on just reading one novel set in that time period. As Wang Lung goes through his life, as his fortunes change, as both good and bad things happen to him in his household, he gradually gains wealth, and by gaining wealth, he gradually begins to want more status, more land, more money. So part of the message that I took from this book is the more you have, the more you want. But it's also interesting that he's becoming newly accustomed to having more and to desiring more. But his children grow up, his sons in particular, grow up having more for most of their lives. While the family has modest means when they are very small children. By the time they are teenagers and adults, the family has more money, and so the sons become accustomed to having this money. And there's a lot of focus on the two eldest sons in particular. Wang Lung sends both of his two eldest sons to school to learn to read and write, to have a scholarly education, which is something that he does not have himself, but he recognizes that there's value to his farm, to his business that he's growing, to his lands, to have someone that he can trust who can read contracts and help negotiate prices and that kind of thing. There is a lot of status associated in the society with being able to send even one son, let alone to school. to learn something that is not tilling the land. So the two eldest sons grow up and they are not farmers. The third son is a farmer, and that has its own implications later on in his life. And the eldest son just wants to coast on the wealth. He gets married, he just wants to spend money. The second son wants to accumulate wealth further and to save money. And so later on in the book, there's this conflict between the two elder sons as they are trying to pull their father in one direction or the other. And Wang Lung is trying to deal with that. He's also starting to deal with the idea that his wife, who is a great farmer's wife, is not really a great aristocrat's wife. And this is all, of course, as defined by social expectations, not defined by Ms. Peepers. But anyway, Olan is very rough, and she is physically strong, and she is a worker, and she is quiet. She is not educated. She does not have, her feet are unbound. So this is during a time when Chinese are still doing foot binding for women, but it's only upper class women, women who don't need to move around a lot, basically, who don't need to do a lot of physical labor. Whereas Olan was a slave in the Great Lord's house, so she is physically able to do that labor, but that's not what he wants out of a wife once his status increases. And so there's that tension as well. And Wang Lung and Olan don't really have a communicative relationship. And so they don't really talk to each other a lot. They don't discuss hopes and dreams. They just go about their days because, again, it is a very much a marriage of convenience. It is, they are not marrying. They did not marry for love, and they don't grow to love each other, but rather they grow to depend on each other because they are part of this familial ecosystem, which is not the same as affection. And I think that Pearl S. Buck does a really good job here of demonstrating the a purely business relationship. And that's not to say, of course, that arranged marriages can't end in emotional connection and even love. That happens, of course it does, but it doesn't always. And that's what Pearl S. Buck is representing here. And I do think, just having read all sorts of books about all sorts of things, I do often see the arranged marriage storyline either going towards, like, okay, we were thrown together, but now we find things to love about each other, and now we are really close emotionally, or going completely the opposite way into straight up like hatred and abuse and toxicity. And this marriage stays in between those two. It's not horribly toxic and abusive to an extreme. There's definitely some emotional neglect. It doesn't occur to Wang Lung that Olan needs emotional support. We only see we're hearing the story from his perspective, so we don't know what Olan is thinking, um, unless she says it to him directly, and she does not speak very often. We don't know what her expectations were. We don't know what her dreams or thoughts are about. By not telling us the inner thoughts of any of the other characters and only sharing what the words that they say and what Wang Lung interprets their actions to mean, we're really getting such a small sliver of the story. And yet, the story is so richly told, and it's happening at this turning point as China is going from having an emperor more towards a communist style government. And those things are happening in the background. They're affecting Wang Lung, but he doesn't pay a lot of attention to the world outside of his own sphere. And just remembering the time period, this is, I think, the 1800s. You're not being accosted on all sides by news articles and people sharing their thoughts on what's going on in the world. You have to seek out information, and typically information about what's going on in the world, and we see this through the sons. Information about what's going on through the world is coming through people who have an education, people who can read. And so his sons know things about the war that's going on and the social change that's coming. So he doesn't think about it, but it affects the way his sons behave. I really loved this book. I thought it was really great. As I was reading it, I kept thinking about two other books. One that I read this year, which is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Not because it's the same story, but rather because it's a similar approach of following a character through significant social changes. And I'll link to my video about Things Fall Apart. It was a really fantastic book that I enjoyed a lot. And it also made me think about Tevye the Dairyman by Sholem Aleichem, which I read many years ago, and on which the musical Fiddler on the Roof was based, because that is also a story about a man who is operating as the world is changing around him and resisting that change. And so it's just a really effective way of telling a story. It's tried and true, but not tired. So I don't make these comparisons to say, oh gosh, she's just doing what other people have done. They're all doing the same thing. It's not that. It's more that this is such an effective story. And if you think about those are three very different cultures, the approach of following a singular character, that microcosm of society through a time when the country around them, the world around them, is changing so significantly, is a really interesting slice of history. Um, and and I think I mentioned in my video, in my reading vlog video when I started reading this, that I don't really know a whole lot about this time period. So to an extent, I'm taking Pearl S. Buck's word for how this is portrayed and how things were. So Pearl S. Buck was American, but her parents were missionaries and they were often stationed in China. So she lived in China for a good portion of her childhood. She also moved there as an adult with her first husband, who was an agricultural economist, and they lived in rural China. So while she is not speaking directly from experience when she's telling this story, she has she had a lot of experiences that um, brought this story to life, and she drew upon the people that she met and the space where she lived in rural China, um, to tell this story. And I like to call that out because there's certainly a lot of concern about who is telling people's stories. And again, we talked about this a little bit with Things Fall Apart, where Chinua Achebe was telling the story of his own people. But I do think it's important to acknowledge when a story is being told by someone not directly from that culture. And also to acknowledge that you can experience a culture pretty fully, even if you're not born in it. So I do want to balance that, but also say I am, again, not an expert in Chinese history. I've never been to China, actually. Be a great experience to visit. But from what I can tell, Pearl S. Buck did have the knowledge necessary to make this a realistic book. This was my first Pearl S. Buck novel as well. So if there's something else that you have read by her that you would recommend, please let me know. Always looking to return to authors, even though I do take a while sometimes. So let me know your thoughts in the comments, and either way, I'll see you in the next one.